The four companies that have come in the limelight as a result of this controversy are Google, Starbucks, Apple, Amazon. A whole bunch of companies that follow transactions through the internet. Briefly, what does Starbucks UK say? By the way, these are not my views. These are picked up from the UK Parliamentary Committee on Inquiry. It opened its operations in the United Kingdom in 1998. It earned over $3 billion in sales for 14 years, and it paid tax of only $8.6 million. In the last 3 years, they did not report any profit and did not pay any tax, but they informed all their shareholders that UK is an extremely profitable operation for them. As a result of the movement, they voluntarily went and said that we will pay 20 million UK pounds as taxes over the next 2 years. Going on, you look at it in the context of UK, Google earned a revenue of $18 billion from 2006 to 2011 and paid corporate tax of only $16 billion. Apple US, which is one of the most profitable companies, has cash reserves and build-up of $150 billion, of which only $40 billion are in headquarters in the United States. The rest of the $110 billion are parked outside the US as a result of preferential treatment that US companies get because of the check-the-box rules. It negotiated a 2% tax rate with the Irish government, and I was not able to verify whether this was with an understanding with the US government or not. What does all of this mean? It raises very important question on morality of tax avoidance. And I just would like to quote two cases, two judgments, few sentences from the judgment. One is by an English quote, which is very often used in India, called the principle of Duke of Westminster, and second is the Supreme Court decision in McDowell's case. Here is what Lord Tomlin had to say in the context of Duke of Westminster. Every man is entitled, if he can, to order his affairs so as that the tax attaching under the appropriate acts is less than it otherwise would be. If he succeeds in ordering them so as to secure this result, then however unappreciative the commissioners of inland revenue or his fellow taxpayers may be of his ingenuity, he cannot be compelled to pay an increased tax. This principle, as most of the practitioners in India know, is still being followed, still being referred to by the highest court of law in our country. This is what the Apex Court had to say in the context of McDowell. Tax planning may be legitimate provided it is within the framework of law. Colorable devices cannot be part of tax planning, and it is wrong to encourage or entertain the belief that it is honorable to avoid the payment of tax by resorting to dubious methods. It is the obligation of every citizen to pay the taxes honestly without resorting to subterfuges. Now, two contradictory views, obviously. As courts, they have a right to express that view. Keeping this in mind, we have structured a discussion, and we are going to have 4 modules to this discussion. I now hand it over to Jeffrey Owens to introduce the first model, for which we are going to have intervention by Mr. Parasaran, Michael Lang, and Mr. Datta. Over to you, Jeffrey.
Thank you for that introduction, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I seem to be spending a lot of time up on this podium, so by now you must be thoroughly fed up with me. Yeah? It's just they couldn't find anybody else, I think. Yes. Let me begin by saying I actually don't like the way the panel question has been formulated. Morality or legality, there's only one answer. Yeah? So maybe it's the wrong way of framing the debate. But let's assume, in fact, that that's our starting point. Why, perhaps it's a good question to begin with, Ian, why are we having this debate? And from the video that we saw yesterday, you can see how the politicians are very engaged in this question of are multinationals paying their fair share of taxes? NGOs are out there lobbying, you're raising the issue. I mean, up to now, I think India's been pretty NGO-free. You don't have a tax justice network here. It'll come, so it's good to prepare for that, yeah? And also citizens have become more engaged, yes? I mean, today, you have normal families who over breakfast discuss transfer pricing, yeah? And I'm not kidding, I have 4 children, and my eldest son said, yeah, Daddy, what do you do with this transfer mispricing? Why are you helping multinationals put their money in tax havens? Yes? So normal families are taking an interest in tax. Huh? And if you look at the profile of tax, I mean, tax was generally at the back page of the Financial Times. Today, it's on the front pages. How many times has tax been on the front pages of the Financial Times over the last 14 months? 10. 10 times. Huh? I mean, I worked in tax 40 years. I've never seen that, yes?
It's every day in India, by the way.
But India is special, yes? The Indian exception, yeah? So in a sense, I mean, we've moved to a situation where international taxation, taxes that are paid or not paid by multinationals, is very much at the top of the political agenda, yes? And I think that's not a bad thing, because in some ways tax is at the center of our democracies. Huh? But what we need to make sure is that the debate, the public debate, is informed. And that's very hard, because for the NGOs, even a one-liner, Google not paying taxes, or Starbucks, not paying tax, it's easy. But then when you have to come back and explain why that is the case, you need 10, 15 pages, not just one line, yes? But I think it's up to all of us in the tax profession to try to educate people so that you can have an informed public debate on this issue. The other thing I think that has happened is that you see that the boards of companies are increasingly discussing tax issues. I mean, there was a survey done in the UK 5 years ago, and it asked how many times have the boards of the top 100 companies discussed tax. 5 years ago, it was once every 2 to 3 years. Some never. Now, keep in mind, tax is the 3rd or the 4th largest cost component of a multinational, yeah? Today, if you ask that same question, I'm pretty sure they would say at least once every 3 months, maybe even more, yeah? So in a sense, the tax directors are getting into the boards much more often. You may not like it, but I mean, that's the reality, yes? So I think things have changed. Why is this debate important from a public policy perspective? The key fact is that for any modern tax system, it can only function if taxpayers comply, or 90% of taxpayers comply for 90% of the time, yeah? You have to have voluntary compliance. You can't enforce compliances. And taxpayers will not voluntarily comply if they perceive, I emphasize the word perceive, if they perceive that high net worth individuals and multinational enterprises are not paying their fair share of tax. No? So we have an interest in this debate because unless we actually can convince the public citizens that everybody is paying their tax, we'll see voluntary compliance diminish, and that we won't be able to operate our tax systems. Is the debate going to go away? I mean, I talk a lot to multinationals these days, and they fall into 2 categories. There's the ostrich category that says, well, we'll just put our head in the sand and we'll keep a low profile, and a year or 2, it'll all move on. It ain't going to happen. Yeah? I think this is Pandora's box that we've opened. We need to engage in it. You need to engage in it because it's going to continue, yes? And that's why I think it's very good to have this as the topic for this discussion here, yes? Perhaps the key question, though, is what do we mean by fair tax? How do we decide whether a multinational is paying its fair amount of tax, yes? I mean, I may be old-fashioned, but I say, look, the key question is not whether it's fair or not, it's whether is a multinational paying the right amount of tax at the right time in the right place. Huh? That's the key question to ask. But of course, you then get into the issue of, well, what do we mean by right? And frankly, that's an issue for government. Yeah? Government has to set the rules so that they feel comfortable with the outcomes from the way that multinationals apply those rules. One thing that has changed over the last 3 years is that we are moving away from a strict legality perspective on the application of tax laws to asking multinationals to comply with both the spirit and the letter of the law. No? And this is a major change that was made in OECD in 2011. The OECD has a set of guidelines for multinational enterprises. These are not the transfer pricing guidelines. These are guidelines that apply right across the field to all activities of multinationals. And when the OECD revised the guidelines in 2011, they had well, first they expanded the guidelines, the chapter on tax. Initially it was one paragraph, it's now 3 or 4 pages. And part of the agreement we had in 2011 was that governments and multinationals agreed that they must comply with the spirit and the letter of the law. Yeah? Now, I know, deciding on what the spirit is, particularly for lawyers, it's a difficult issue. You may not like it, but that's where we are today. And frankly, is it so difficult to determine what is the spirit of the law? I mean, you can look and you can ask, what was the intent of the legislators? Is there substance behind a transaction? Yeah? Would this transaction have taken place absent tax? Is it a contrived transaction? Is it just driven by tax considerations? Yes? Is the effective tax rate that you arrive at, is that in some way ethical? Yeah? Is it sustainable? Yeah? Will the CEO be able to defend it in 5 years' time? Yeah? And I think, in fact, that so there are many ways that you can actually interpret what, in practice, we mean by the spirit of the law. And in many ways, all of these questions are getting integrated into this whole question of the GARs, yes? And that's a topic that we'll come to with Michael in a moment's time, yes? What is clear is tax planning will continue. But I think the nature of tax planning is going to change, and there'll be much more emphasis, in fact, on making sure that your tax planning is sustainable, that your tax planning does have substance behind it, yes? And in some ways, I think what I would like to see is that this debate on fair tax leads to a different type of debate between government and businesses, that you actually have a more constructive dialogue between the tax administration and business, a dialogue that's based on openness, on trust, on a willingness to disclose, where multinationals educate the tax authorities, where tax authorities educate the multinationals in terms of what government is trying to do, because that's the way you build up trust. And to get to trust, you need transparency, yes? As I said yesterday, the 3 T's, tax, trust, and transparency, they have to go together. So what are the implications of this in a sense, for multinationals? I mean, the first thing is that you should not treat this as a moral issue. I actually think it's a bottom line issue, yeah? Because if you are on the front pages of the Financial Times for not paying tax, for having 1,250 sort of subsidiaries in tax havens, that's not good for you as a company. That's going to affect your long-term profitability. Why? Because it influences the way that your customers see you. 54% of the population in the UK are no longer buying coffee from Starbucks. Yeah? 54%. Yeah? So you have that. It also influences the way your suppliers perceive you. And it influences the way that government perceives. And don't forget, a lot of companies, government is a big client, yeah? But even more important, it influences the way employees perceive you as a company, yes? Employees, I think, don't like to work for a company which is in the headlines for not paying tax systematically, yeah? So there are good bottom line reasons why I think multinationals need to take this issue quite seriously, yes? What are some of the implications, I think, of this fair tax debate? The first is that I think the role of tax directors is going to change. You're going to have to become much more tax diplomats. You can't just be good technicians. You're going to have to be prepared to explain more what your tax strategies are, explain not just in the courts, but also in the public domain, yeah? I think also another practical implication is that I think we have to accept that tax is just not any cost. It's a different type of cost. It has a social dimension, yes? So even though it's an important cost, we have to treat it differently. A third implication, I think, is that multinationals should not treat their tax departments as profit centers. And there are, particularly US multinationals, where the tax department is actually seen as a profit center. That's the wrong starting point, yes? And linked to that, if you have bonuses of the top management in a company, where the bonus is determined on a post-tax basis, that's giving the wrong incentives, because for every dollar of tax you save, the CEO gets another dollar of revenue, yeah? All the wrong incentives. And it's no coincidence that companies that have that model have the largest tax departments, yeah? And I'm being serious. Facts. This is not fiction, it's facts, yes? So we need to move away from that, and I think the OECD should be saying it's bonuses should be determined on a pre-tax basis. That sends the right signals. Yes? Another implication is that boards need to take more interest in tax, because boards will put the effective tax rates in the broader context of how will this affect our reputation and what are the financial implications. Yes?